Hi, Paul. Good morning. It's the 11th of October, Tuesday. Here's the heads up brief for today.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks. Go ahead, mate.
So, the big news is Malaysia, Paul. The National Parliament was dissolved yesterday by Prime Minister Ismail Sabri. Elections are to be held within 60 days. The Election Commission is working on the dates at the moment. The Met Department in Malaysia had warned against holding elections at the moment, as did opposition parties and members of the ruling coalition. Some local governments have said that they also won't dissolve the state assemblies, so it's a pretty messy situation at the moment.
Okay, I'll come back to Malaysia when you finish your brief. Thank you.
Sure, Paul. In Indonesia, there's a workers' protest in Jakarta tomorrow and across Indonesia. It's against the recent fuel price hikes, the omnibus law on job creation, and they're also demanding increases to minimum wages, amongst other labor issues.
Are they getting any momentum there in terms of numbers attending, and how much of this is political groups trying to rally for the upcoming, I mean, they're still 18 months sort of away, but for the next Indonesian elections?
Uh, that's a good question, Paul. So in terms of numbers, no, we're not really seeing the kind of mass rallies that we saw in 2020 against the omnibus law at that time. And organizers have delayed protests. They aren't able to hold disruptive protests, and their strike actions haven't really disrupted anything either. So the momentum really isn't there. But it's more, as you observed, it's a political exercise, I feel. One of the main groups organizing some of these labor protests is the newly formed Labour Party, which is linked to the Confederation of Indonesian Trade Unions. So they're trying to build their profile up for 2024, and they have registered for the elections. So they've been organizing protests, trying to organize protests nearly every week now.
Okay, hopefully eventually they'll fade out because people may get tired of their shenanigans, but keep a close eye on their leadership and update me on their leadership in a couple of weeks as it evolves, please.
Yeah, sure, Paul. In Myanmar, clashes are intensifying between the military and Arakan army in some parts of Rakhine State, especially near the border with Bangladesh. There was an incident recently in which Rohingya refugees on the Bangladeshi side of the border were hit by crossfire. I think one person died and three people were injured.
Yeah, okay,
Moving
go
on.
on.
In Thailand, Tamanat Prampao, the leader of the Thai Economic Party, stepped down from his position. It's expected that he will move to the Pheu Thai Party linked to the Shinawatras.
Okay, that's a very interesting progression. Thank you.
In Papua New Guinea, Paul, there's increased security in Erema in Port Moresby. There has been tribal violence between communities from the Eastern Highlands and Anga provinces. 3 people have been killed and 6 people have been injured so far.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Moving over to South Asia, in Pakistan, Imran Khan's Tehreek-e-Insaf will be holding rallies in Punjab and Karachi ahead of the October 18th by-elections. In India, there were communal clashes yesterday in West Bengal. Tensions between the Hindu and Muslim communities are continuing to cause violence. 40 people were arrested in the area yesterday. Lastly, for the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region, Paul, Russia attacked targets across Ukraine yesterday, including in Kiev, killing 11 people and injuring 64. Now, this was in retaliation for the Crimea Bridge attack. The rail track on the Crimea Bridge has been restored, as has one-way traffic on the bridge.
Yeah, I believe there's still like 10 to 15 hour delays to get across it, so we'll keep an eye on that. Okay, if there's nothing else, I'll move on to Malaysia.
Yep, Paul, sure, go ahead.
Okay, so look, the key thing with Malaysia is obviously it's like all elections in Malaysia, contentious. There's a lot of agendas there that are more than political. They're really about, you've got the whole Sultanate system there. Obviously, there's a lot of money and economic advantages at stake. The calling of the election now in the middle of what is the worst monsoon we've seen for a few years here on the Malay Peninsula. So we really need to keep an eye on that. But what is typically in the elections in recent elections, how much violence has there been, Uday? What's the likely effect there on the streets in the various major urban areas?
Paul, in terms of violence, it's been relatively low scale. There have been some scuffles during election times and campaigns between supporters of different parties, but it's not very significant levels of violence. And in terms of protests, we aren't seeing this protests that we saw in the 2010s, the Bercy size protests. But in recent weeks, there was a demonstration in Kuala Lumpur, for example. A few hundred people protested against elections being held now. Now, this could increase and possibly spread to other parts, including Johor, Penang, and parts of Sabah and Sarawak. As you have noted, there has been a history of youth and mass protests against government in Malaysia, and this is especially over corruption. Now, something that's very interesting, and we are keeping a watch on it, Paul, is that there's a corruption case concerning the leader of the United Malay Nationalist Organization, Ahmed Zahid. And that's one of the reasons why UMNO called is pressing for early elections to try to avoid a prosecution in cases scheduled for next year. So all these dynamics could create an environment where, protests could break out over all these issues, but violence at this point, I'm not seeing much.
Okay, just remember too to brief your relevant analysts that sitting in the backdrop too is the former Prime Minister.
Yep.
And the whole 1MDB $1 million scandal. And
yep.
He'd really love to overrule findings against him. So keep an eye on that. Look, excellent brief today. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. Cheers.
All right. Thanks, Paul.